Hey everyone, and welcome back to This Explainer. Today, we are unraveling a seriously fascinating corporate detective story. We're going to look at how a completely worthless pile of industrial waste was literally weaponized to execute a massive financial exploit inside a thermal power plant. Honestly, it's an absolute masterclass in why you always have to look behind the numbers.
Right off the bat, let's look at this number, 5.4 million rupees. Now, you might be thinking that's revenue from some exciting new product launch. Nope, that is the exact amount of pure, 100% artificial value that was magically injected into a thermal power plant's inventory assets. Just out of nowhere, boom, the company's balance sheet looked incredibly healthy.
So, we really have to ask, how on earth did a literal mountain of toxic fly ash manage to completely fake a corporate balance sheet? To figure out how they pulled off this illusion, we have to dig into the human element behind the spreadsheets and the incredibly clever but deeply flawed financial engineering they used to make it happen.
Well, the core motivation here shouldn't be too surprising. It all comes down to intense corporate pressure. The finance controller of this plant was in the hot seat, getting major heat from leadership to hit very specific working capital and profitability targets for that quarter. And, as we see time and time again in risk management, when that kind of pressure mounts, the numbers will almost always find a way to bend.
Okay, let's get into Section 1, the 14-ton trick.
Believe it or not, pulling off this multi-million rupee financial heist didn't take some elaborate web of offshore shell companies. It actually hinged entirely on one single isolated microtransaction with a local road contractor. To make this work, the controller exploited a really fundamental accounting principle, net realizable value, or NRV. Basically, to legally slap a financial value onto their massive stockpile of fly ash, which, remember, is just toxic waste from burning coal, the controller desperately needed an NRV benchmark. They needed to prove a selling price existed to justify the standard cost they wanted to attach to that waste.
And here is where the sheer audacity of this fraud just blows my mind. So, a local road contractor needed a tiny bit of fill material, right? The plant sold them a measly 14 tons of fly ash for 300 rupees per ton. The controller then took that one-off 14-ton invoice and literally used it as the benchmark to artificially value their entire stockpile. I'm talking an 18,000-ton mountain of waste, suddenly all valued at that exact same 300 rupee rate.
The double whammy financial impact of this little trick was staggering. First, it artificially inflated their inventory assets by that 5.4 million rupees, which instantly boosted their working capital and made things look great for the banks and investors. But second, because standard accounting rules let you credit byproduct value against your manufacturing costs, by faking that 5.4 million in ash value, they deducted it right out of their total coal consumption costs. This artificially lowered the reported cost of power production and completely masked reality with a fake layer of operational efficiency.
Which brings us to Section 2, Danger of Desk Auditing.
So you're probably wondering, how in the world wasn't this caught right away? Well, this whole case study is a glaring neon warning sign about the absolute danger of desk-based auditing. Just checking the boxes completely failed here. The standard desk audit was basically a trap. Sure, they checked the physical volume. Yes, the 18,000 tons actually sat there in the yard. And yes, they checked the math. 18,000 times 300 definitely equals 5.4 million. It looked absolutely perfect on paper. But they totally missed the reality because they never bothered to look at the historical dispatch logs, and they completely ignored the environmental regulations that govern that specific asset.
Because here's the actual business reality that the desk auditor totally missed. In India, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has extremely strict mandates. They require 100% of this toxic fly ash to be fully utilized, which practically means it's legally required to be sent off to cement companies for free or at a zero-based cost. Because of that heavy regulatory reality, the true net realizable value of that ash is, for all intents and purposes, zero.
Let's move on to Section 3, Catching the Fraud. The whole illusion finally shattered when a genuinely vigilant auditor stepped in. This auditor didn't just stare at a spreadsheet, they actually looked at the business itself. They applied a really strict substance over form approach. By running a simple, automated price-to-volume scatterplotting script, they visualized the data, and guess what? 99.9% of all historical ash volume went to cement companies for absolutely zero cost. So that 300 rupee transaction for 14 tons, it stuck out like a sore thumb as a manufactured, totally non-representative microtransaction that was deliberately used to bypass reality. But we have to acknowledge, the root cause wasn't just one rogue controller, it was an entirely compromised control environment. They had a deeply flawed NRV testing framework,
a total lack of any system volume limits, and a massive segregation of duties failure. The financial reporting team was just operating in their own little silo, totally disconnected from the actual environmental, social, and governance realities happening down on the plant floor.
Next up, Section 4, Hard-Coded Process Engineering.
Okay, now that we've exposed the exploit, how do we make sure it never, ever happens again? We have to shift from just detecting problems to actionable prevention, and that requires hard-coded process engineering to permanently slam that valuation loophole shut. We can do this with 3 structural fixes. Step 1 is volume-weighted NRV capping. This means actually programming the ERP to use a 12-month trailing volume-weighted average price. Mathematically, a tiny 14-ton outlier is just going to completely vanish when you average it against 100,000 tons of zero-cost dispatches. Step 2 requires that any benchmark transaction actually has to represent at least 15 to 20% of your total annual volume.
And Step 3 introduces really strict byproduct accounting locks. Under the old system, the finance controller could just push through a unilateral override. The new engineered system, it requires a strict dual authorization workflow, meaning you literally cannot apply any byproduct credit to the cost of generation without digital sign-offs from both the technical plant head and the environmental compliance head. It forces the silos to talk.
Finally, Section 5, the Ultimate Control Test.
Which brings us to the real climax of this explainer, and the absolute core lesson every professional needs to take away from the Ash asset illusion. Deeply understanding your business's operational and regulatory reality is the ultimate control environment test. You simply cannot audit from a desk. To truly protect a company, you have to ensure that a tiny, isolated 14-ton microtransaction is never allowed to mask an 18,000-ton regulatory reality. So, I'll leave you with a thought to chew on today. Is an isolated microtransaction currently hiding a massive regulatory reality in your balance sheet right now? It's definitely a question worth asking your internal teams this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you found this breakdown valuable and you want to keep mastering the structure behind the numbers, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives. Stay sharp, stay objective, and keep learning.